And I'm glad that Ambassador Arthur Hartman is with us today, the very man who functioned as the intermediary between the State Department and the White House on CCE-related matters, and as Henry Kissinger claimed in his memoirs, the only man who had been able to explain CCE to him.
That was right.
Thank you. Actually, I've absented myself from another meeting. The former ambassadors, American ambassadors to Russia or the Soviet Union, and Russian ambassadors to the United States are meeting here in Washington these last 2 days. And much of our discussion goes to process, although we did not discuss particularly this process. We discussed, for example, why, when the Soviet Union began to disintegrate, more thought was not given to the question of how the security situation had so changed that perhaps the structures ought to be re-examined, meaning, of course, NATO and what NATO's function is. And all one has to do is sort of read today's press about the situation in Georgia to see that this question is constantly in the forefront of people's minds when they discuss change, peaceful change, or some leaders may have in mind something less peaceful. But I think the significant fact of the Helsinki process was that it was assumed that whatever change took place was going to have to be peaceful. I still have all the scars, and one of my colleagues can be witness to this, of Henry Kissinger beating me up every time I went into his office on the subject of Basket 3 and what its importance was and why I was causing all this trouble, so that when he went to talk to Mr. Gromyko at that time, Gromyko was constantly needling him about why we were putting such emphasis on this. Well, I don't think Kissinger ever accepted some of my rationale, but certainly those of my colleagues who pushed this very hard with me felt that one of the more subversive things we could do in terms of getting people to think again about the system that had been first imposed on the Russian people and then later on the people of Eastern Europe was to get them talking about some of these issues that were in so-called Basket 3. And in fact, I won't say that that was the principal thing that got people to rethinking their positions, but it certainly undermined this idea that the security forces could control the situation once it got started. Because quite clearly, even in Russia, that was not the case. Although some of us are wondering whether they're going to try it again, it still was quite evident that Gorbachev, particularly, had started a process building on what was going on in the whole Helsinki period of negotiations, whereby he was going to extend to his society this element of openness, this element of getting the people involved in discussing how they were organized, what their complaints were, and listening. After all, Gorbachev was the one who asked Sakharov to come back to Moscow, and where he promptly led the group that wanted to discuss a greater democratization of society, a pluralism in society. And a lot of that, of course, has been lost in recent years, but I have high hopes that it's going to come back again. But the point about the Helsinki process, I think, was, first of all, there was great skepticism in Washington Kissinger realized, well, first of all, he distrusted Egon Bahr. He thought Egon Bahr, in fact, might be a fellow who was in the pay of the Soviets to pull the wool over our eyes and convince us that somehow or other this evolutionary change was going to be possible, and all we had to do was recognize Russia's position, the Soviet Union's position in Eastern Europe. And the whole debate between the right wing in America and the people around President Ford hinged on that subject. You know, have you given away the store by allowing the Russians to claim that they now have fixed for all time these borders? Well, it wasn't very long after that that a kiss was bestowed on the leader of the GDR, which meant a kiss off in American terms, that Russia was not going to stand in the way of German reunification. And in fact, there was a counterpart to that, which is only now being discussed a bit as we talk about Georgia. What assurances were given to the leadership in the Soviet Union first and then Russia later about the reunification of Germany and Russian acquiescence in a united Germany's joining NATO? What sort of assurances were given by James Baker, for example, that NATO forces would never be moved to the border of Russia? These are in the documentation, and I trust that future researchers will find them somewhere. But I know from people who were present that that was the kind of assurance that was given. And whether it was persuasive to the Russians, probably they didn't quite believe it themselves. But it's clear that a bargain was struck and that the whole Helsinki process had played a role in this bargain. Russian leadership realized that Germany had, that the FRG, had played a key role in bringing along Western opinion and Western governments to accept a loosening, the so-called détente effects, a loosening of the Russian control on Eastern Europe, and in return for that, an incorporation more and more of these countries on the basis of free choice and whether or not borders would be changed. The borders were not important in that respect, except with respect to Poland. And so the whole idea of the Helsinki process was to bring an end to this whole period of division in Europe through peaceful means. And it seems to me that process was a great success. We unfortunately didn't apply the same creativity to a process with the end of the Soviet Union in thinking through what that meant in terms of potential future conflicts in Europe, ethnic difficulties in practically every one of these countries, and did we need another process to discuss how those would be handled in the future? One of the advantages of being semi-retired is that I have a chance of reading a lot more than I did in my previous functions. And one of the things I've been looking at is the whole question of the development of nationality and its effect on ethnic groups from the 19th century on through Woodrow Wilson's, 15 points? How many points did he have? 14, sorry. And the question of what was the basis for self-determination? What was the basis for people within a nation state who felt oppressed, who felt that their cultures were not being recognized, who felt indeed that they were being oppressed in real terms, in physical terms. How could one take account of that within the nation-state system? And it's quite clear we didn't do enough thinking about that in the post-Soviet era in Europe. Whether we can now recapture some of that, and we're already setting the precedents. We've had a vote in Kosovo, which they in effect withdrew from a nation state. They actually used the Helsinki agreements as their one of their justifications, but we never got to the Security Council, so the whole UN system was not there to recognize that such a change could take place peacefully, and the Russians are now using the Kosovo the Kosovo precedent for some of the things that they've been saying. And I encourage you all to read Mr. Medvedev's latest statement on the question of what is the Lebensraum for the new Russia around its borders, to see that this is not going to be a problem that goes away. This is a problem that is with us. One last comment on this. We were talking about, well, you know, is this just something in Eastern Europe and close to the Soviet borders? And I said, well, you know, in 50 or 60 years, who can say what Southern California is going to want to vote in favor of when the overwhelming majority of those people are Hispanic? And then one of the Russians popped up and said, yes, and what about Alaska?